We're going to talk about cheap and easy worm bins, but we're also since it would take less than 5 minutes to tell you how to do it, we're going to talk about worm composting in general, because that's probably what you want to know as well. If you don't, stop me and we'll be done in 5 minutes. But anyway, let's keep going. We waste a lot of food in the United States, a lot of food, and there's so much that goes into the landfill that we could actually put into something like a compost bin in the yard or in our worm bin. So I'm not going to read through all that, but we just waste a lot of food. So here's what we would think about as composting, but there is another way, and we'll talk about that right now. Yes, worms. In particular, well, let's talk about what composting is first. On the left there is kind of your normal compost bin, and we call that a controlled biological process that you're doing. And you're putting all this waste in, but the main actors are all the bacteria, fungi, macroinvertebrates, and all that stuff that actually do the decomposing for you. And your end product is humus, not hummus, humus, which is a great product to use on your vegetable gardens and gardens in general. But what we're going to talk about is on the right, where we're vermicomposting, and that's a process where we are harnessing the power of worms to convert organic materials into a really valuable soil amendment. And that product is the worm castings. For those of you who don't know, that is worm poop. And why would we even want to consider doing this if we've got space for a compost pile? Mainly because it requires very little space, and you can do it with, when it's 10 degrees outside, I really don't want to go to the compost pile. So this allows you to do some composting inside, which is nice when you don't want to make that trip out. And of course, it reduces the amount of garbage going to the landfill or in your compost pile. We're producing this really nice vermicompost. And if you fish at all or have family that fish, you ought to be doing vermicomposting because you'll have all the worms you ever need. Now, which worms do we choose? There's a lot of worm species in the world, and only 7 are mainly used for composting, and these are called epigeic. That's because they are composting in the organic layer, that very top thin layer out there in the natural world. So that's why we call them epigeic, because they're on the outside edge. We're mainly using red wigglers, which is Eisenia fetida. There are some other that can work, but this is the main one you're going to find. They're readily available, so I would definitely go with those. And I've got a lot of experience with this, probably over 15 years now. All right, so we decided we want a vermicompost. So what do we got to do? First thing we want to do is go get a bin to put them in. Mainly, it just needs to be dark, opaque. You don't want light to be able to go through it. Worms do need dark. They do need oxygen. They do need moisture, and they need food. That's really the 4 things that they need. But this bin needs to provide the darkness and the oxygen. So you're going to have to put some ventilation holes in there. The third bullet there that says drainage holes, I have had the same worm bin since 2006, and I've never put a hole in the bottom. Okay, it can be done. It makes it really, really simple. So I prefer that. I don't want to have to deal with all the stuff coming out of the bottom. It's just about moisture management. That's what it gets down to. Your bin has to be deep enough to hold your worms, obviously, and you don't want it to rot. So you want it to be just a plastic bin, works fine. Although there are people that use wood, which is fine too. So the second step is you're gonna put in some bedding for the worms to actually do their thing in. We usually use just shredded black and white newspaper. That's, again, readily available. It's something you would compost or throw away anyway. I've not used paper bags before, but they certainly can be used. I have used office paper before. I don't like it as well as I do newspaper, but that's up to you. They will use it and live in it just fine. And also you can use some cardboard. So what I do, and some people will tell you different, but basically what I do is I shred the newspaper. Just take your hand and shred it down lengthways. Fill up the entire bin with your newspaper, dry newspaper, and then wet it down carefully. Don't pour in a whole bunch of water that you'll have to pour out, but basically you're going to keep adding a little bit of water, mixing it as you go until you've got good moisture, but no free water on the bottom. Okay. And I didn't talk about the size of the bin before. I've used 14 gallon. I just bought some new worms just for this. And it was one thing I could find was 18 gallons. So these little 14 gallon bins work fine. They don't take up any space at all. Okay, so you've got your dampened newspaper in your bin after you drilled the holes. We'll talk about that in a second. I'll do some show and tell. The next thing you want to add is just a handful of soil. And that is a pretty important step because in that handful of soil is going to have all the microbes that are going to be needed and the grit actually too, that's needed for the worms. The grit for the worms, the microbes to start decomposing the food you put in there. You can also add grit using eggshells. I do that when I remember, which isn't very often, unfortunately, but you dry your eggshells for a couple days, put them in a bag and take a hammer to them, rolling pin, whatever, and pulverize them. And then you can add those in small amounts to the bin and the worms will use that. They have a gizzard, just like a chicken. So they're going to use that grit in their gizzard to grind the food that they're eating. And the fourth thing you do is you get your worms. So again, I prefer the red wigglers. There are others, but these are very, very good worms. They survive extremes in temperature a little bit better than some other worms. And they just do a fantastic job. And they're pretty. They're pretty. They're nice and red. You can get worms from a number of places, but I prefer worm growers online and other vermicomposters. You can get them from bait shops, but in a bait shop little styrofoam cup, it's going to take a tremendous amount of worms and an enormous amount of paper cups to fill up your bin. Usually what we're talking about is using around a pound of worms in a 14 to 18 gallon bin. All right, so once you get your worms, and I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff here in a minute. They will be in a big wad, just like you see in that upper left-hand picture. I call them a wad of worms. That's what they are, a wad of worms. And you really just want to put some food in, ease the worms in. Actually, I would put the worms in first, kind of spread them out on the newspaper if you can. Keep the lid off for a little while because the light is going to drive them down into the bedding. And then maybe after a day or so, so they get kind of acclimated, you're going to start to put the food in. So fruits and vegetables is mainly what we're talking about. And the most important part of that is going to be making sure you've got a lot of surface area because that's what it's all about. More surface area means they're going to be able to access it and feed on it quicker. So very important to cut things up. And I'll show you what somebody did in another worm bin here in just a second. Also, very important thing to do is to cover any food that you put in the bin with an inch or so of your bedding. That could be the newspaper or the cardboard or whatever, but that is very important because you will inevitably get some fruit flies in there, and the fruit flies can go right through the little holes you drill. And yeah, it's not fun. I've had the fruit flies in there. They're a pain in the butt to get rid of, but you can get rid of them. Just be sure you cover up the food. And there's your end result is after 6, 9 months, 12 months, you're going to have some really nice compost castings that you can then use in other ways. I tend not to want to use them in out in the garden because there's such a lot of volume of soil out there. I don't feel like I'm making a difference. So I tend to like to use this in my potting mixes, you know, make it half and half, or sometimes I've done it 100%. A lot of people don't like you to do that, but I use it as a potting mix and I start my seeds that way. So it's all about the food. So when you're feeding them, make sure you do not put in these types of foods. Meats, actually, they do eat meat, but because of the smell that can occur, and it takes them a while to eat all that. If you put a big chicken leg in there, I mean, it's going to take a while for them to eat it. So it's going to get pretty rancid before they eat it completely. So we try to avoid that. And of course, you know, same sort of stuff you wouldn't put in a compost pile for the most part, except for citrus and your onions and garlic. You definitely don't want to put that in your worm bin. The citrus mainly because it decreases the pH and will kill your worms. But you definitely don't want to put tobacco in there, salty foods. Don't put your pet poop in there, please. So anyway, just avoid those things and everything will be great. And then basically almost any fruit or vegetable will work for them, as long as, again, the key is making sure you've got it in small bits so those microbes can start decomposing the edges, kind of getting them nasty, and those worms can just, you know, suck it in. So that's what we want. All right, so just some rules of thumb here. In general, 1 pound of worms may eat up to 2 pounds of scraps per week. Now, when you first get your worms, don't throw in 2 pounds right off the bat. They've been shipped and gone through the mail system, UPS, and they're skinny, they're dehydrated. So when you put them in there, give them a day, and then start feeding them slowly some of the good foods. But when the worms start to build up in their populations, then they might be able to handle 2 pounds of scraps. We also, again, more food surface area is better. Always chop things up. The key to my cheap and easy worm bin is moisture control. So you want to make sure that you're not allowing so much moisture to build up, because if you put in something like cantaloupe and melons, I mean, that is so much water going in there. So you better put some dry bedding on top to kind of counteract the amount of moisture you're going to get from those foods. But you can have a worm bin turkey baster nearby. And if you do get any that starts collecting on the bottom, and you will know it because it will start to smell, and your worms may exit the bin, then you can just slurp that out and put it somewhere else. All right, the flip side of that is you definitely don't want the bin to dry out. That is one of the requirements for worms, is they have to have moisture, so don't let it dry out. And as far as the temperature in your house is great, and I would encourage you to put these in your house. You all who are agents out there in the extension land, this is the easiest thing to take to classrooms and teach about composting and recycling and all sorts of things. Plus, they love to hold the worms. So just keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to bore you a little bit, but when I first got these worms in 2006, I recorded and weighed every single thing I put in the bin. You can see, maybe you can't see, probably can't see, but you know, melon scraps, hamburger buns. I had birthday cake one time I put in there. Hot peppers, sweet potatoes. I mean, you name it, I stuck it in there, except for citrus and garlic and onions. But what you're seeing there is from late June until February. And at that point, I separated the castings from the worms, and my 1 pound of worms went from 1 pound to 4.5 pounds, roughly. Okay, roughly. And in my opinion, over the course of the year, I think I fed them about 120 something pounds of food. in my one little 14-gallon tote, but I will tell you that I probably starved them. I did not feed them as much as I could have. So just take that 120 pounds and add, maybe 50 pounds in a year. I mean, that's pretty significant, I thought. And, you feel like you're doing some good, plus you're getting castings out of it. All right, inevitably, the question comes up is how you harvest the castings. Well, that I like to let the worms do it themselves. It's more hands off. Yeah, probably some worms are going to die and some little eggs are going to die. We'll talk about the eggs and cocoons in a minute, but basically it's a bait and switch. On the bottom left over there, what you see is you take all the castings. Again, this is after 6 or 8 or 9 months or a year that you're feeding the worms. You'll see the castings build up. The bin will get heavier and heavier. It just does. So what you do is you pull all the castings over to one side, and then you put fresh bedding and fresh food in the other side and walk away for about a month. And all the worms will then go to the fresh food side, and then you can harvest the other side. So that's one way. That's called the bait and switch, I guess. I have done the second one there, where you use these, basically you dump the worm bin out and on a big plastic sheet on a table, and you separate the castings into small piles, and you have some lights that you put down over top of those piles, and the worms will go to the bottom of each of those little piles, and then you can just scoop off the top, and you can keep doing that a number of times until they're just nothing but worms on the table. So that's one way to do it. And that works pretty good, but that's a lot of labor involved. I've had master gardeners doing it with me, and I think they got kind of tired of it. So it's not an easy thing, the pile method. The telescoping bins I've never used before. It should work. But what you would do is you would, in the bin that you have, you would put holes in the bottom, maybe a 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more, 5/16, something like that. Drill some holes in the bottom of your bin, put that in, or I'm sorry, wait, I did that opposite. Wait. Do not put holes in the bottom of your worm bin. Get a new bin that will telescope down into your old bin. Put holes in the bottom of that one, set it on top of your existing worm bin where you want to get the castings out. Put bedding and food up in the upper one. Just making sense, I hope, since I screwed it all up. Put fresh food and bedding in the top one, and the worms will migrate up through those holes into the new bin. Again, that's kind of a walk away, do it yourself sort of thing that you don't have to put a lot of labor into it. I hope that made sense. I'll answer some more questions if I have to about it in a second. All right, and just some little facts about worms. Worms are hermaphrodites. That means they have both male and female parts. They come together and they will exchange sperm and slough off. Basically, they're sloughing off. There's a little wrinkly place around worms that's called a clitellum, and if the worm has that, that means they're capable of reproduction. So what happens is that clitellum, they get the slimy stuff on each of the worms that are mating, and they basically slough it off, and what you see down there in the lower right hand corner are worm eggs, worm cocoons. And it is so fun, I think, but maybe not for you. I think it's so fun to look through your bin and find these little cocoons. They are going to give birth to anywhere from 2 to 7 baby worms, but it's usually just 2 or 3. Worms don't have eyes, but they are sensitive to light and touch, so that's why you want that bin really dark, but they cannot see. And individual worms will live about a year. So, but in your worm bin, you'll never see a dead worm. Because they kind of take care of themselves. They do breathe through their skin, and therefore they need a very, very high humidity environment to do that. And the old tale about, cutting a worm in half, well, you get 2 worms. Nope, you'll get one worm. You get the same worm back. The worm, the head part can regenerate a tail, but not the other way around. All right, I believe I'm done. So I'm going to stop sharing real quick. I'm going to turn this thing around so you can see my worm bin. And we'll go over a couple of things that I didn't really get to. Well, I got to them, but we'll just repeat. So this is my new worm bin that I just purchased. Could not find a dark blue one. And you all will get to see my old bin that I've had since 2006. I haven't taken the lid off for a couple of days, and it looks like a couple have tried to escape here. So I don't know if you can see this or not. On the very edge right here, there's some worms that are trying to escape. When this happens, first of all, it happens a lot when you first get your bin because they're just not used to the environment. So you need, but once you have your worm bin, had it for a while, and you see them escaping, something is wrong. So you got to figure out what's wrong. All right, so if you all can see, there we put a 1/8 of an inch holes drilled around the sides here at the top. We've also got the same holes drilled around the edges and the side. Okay. This is not going to look like anything at all because it's a brand new worm bin, but that's all it looks like. I probably need to put more bedding in. I did it very quickly, but they're in here and they look to be fairly happy since just 1 or 2. I fed them some pears when I first put it in here, some old rotten pears that I had. I put some more lettuce in here. That's really all there is to it. Again, this is cheap and easy. It works, but you do have to do a good job of moisture control. Okay, I'm going to show you. Before I get to my old bin, I'm going to show you this book, Worms Eat My Garbage. Very good book. I would highly recommend it if you're going to have a worm bin. It's really interesting. It actually is very interesting. Very comprehensive as well. Oh, there's a worm on the table. He must have fallen off. I'll put him back in. All right, this is the worm bin I've had since 2006. This is a 14-gallon. The one I just showed you over here was an 18-gallon. Same thing, the holes in the top. And I'll tip this over and let you see it. You probably can't see it very well, but I'm going to show you. Oh my gosh, somebody put, can you all see that? Somebody put a corn cob in here. I did not do that. That's a kind of a no-no. Anyway, this is the end result. Are these really nice? Can you all see that? Really nice castings. This is the worm poop. This is great stuff.